It's something like adopting a form of metaphysical courage that's transcendent, right? Because let's say you have to take on the suffering of your own life forthrightly, and to the degree that you're able to do that, you'll be able to maintain your moral compass despite your suffering and maybe work to ameliorate it. And in order to do that, you have to adopt a particular pattern of being. And that pattern of being isn't just unique to you. Like, you have to manifest it in your own life, but the pattern is universal and it's divine and sacred for exactly that reason. And the pattern is something like forthright confrontation with those things that terrify you. So there's a story, this is very cool, and some people have heard me talk about this before, and maybe we can close with this. Here's something that I've been chewing on that's quite the miracle, and I don't know how else to really explain it. So when the Israelites are lost in the desert, they start to become fractious and idol worshiping. And so they fall prey to ideological possession, fundamentally. They lose faith in the spirit that brought them out of tyranny. And no wonder, because they're in the desert. It's like they're not having a good time. So it's no wonder they get faithless. But what happens when they get faithless is that God sends poisonous snakes in to bite them. And you might think, well, that doesn't reflect very well on God. And that's one of the interesting things about the Bible, is that there are plenty of stories that have that strange paradoxical twist. It doesn't matter. The story really means that just because you're lost doesn't mean there isn't something stupid you can do to make it worse. And faithlessness will certainly make it worse. And so God sends in these poisonous snakes, and the Israelites are getting bitten pretty good. And so they go to Moses and they say, look, we're sorry that we're so faithless and useless and fractious and divided, but the snakes are getting a bit much, so maybe you go have a chat with God and get him to call them off. And so Moses says, okay, and he goes and talks to God, and God says, he's irritated with the Israelites, but he can be bargained with, apparently. And Moses makes the case for the Israelites. He said they've been punished enough. And God, what should happen, or what could happen, is that God just gets rid of the snakes, because he sent them to begin with. He can just chase them away. But that isn't what happens. And this is very strange. And I defy anyone to come up with a simple explanation for this, because it's really something uncanny. So what God tells Moses to do is to make a bronze stake, a staff, which is like the staff of Moses, and it's like the tree of life. That's another way of thinking about it, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. To make a staff out of bronze, and then to cast a serpent in bronze, and to put the serpent on the staff, and then to have the Israelites come and look at the serpent. And if they look at the serpent, then the poison will no longer destroy them. So he doesn't get rid of the poison. He doesn't get rid of the snakes. What he does instead is he gets the Israelites to gaze upon that which poisons them. And the consequence of that is that they'll be strengthened. And that's this. Now, the cool twist on this is that that's what Christ says about himself. Like thousands of years later, he says, unless his image is lifted up the same way the serpent's image was lifted up in the desert, that there's no possibility of redemption. Now, that's a very weird juxtaposition of ideas, right? Because you think, well, what the hell's going on in the desert, and what's up with the bronze snake? That's a mystery in and of itself, which I think is associated with the necessity of facing that which can bite you, right? To pay attention to it, to adopt a stance of challenge in relationship to it. It's a very deep idea. But then to make the case that that's analogous in some sense to the crucifix, that's an unbelievably sophisticated psychological move. Because you might say, well, what's the sum total of all snakes? And I think you can make a very straightforward and compelling psychological case that there's no confrontation that's more ridden with snakes than the confrontation that's laid out in the story of the Passion. It's a limit story. So it takes all possible snakes into account: betrayal, death at the hands of the mob, innocent suffering, like you name it. It's part of the suffering in that story. So it takes that snake and it makes it into a meta snake, and it says, well, it's one thing to look at just a snake and to get braver as a consequence, but you should instead look at the mother of all snakes and get as brave as that could possibly make. And then you think, well, if you're going to cope successfully with your life, with all of its particularized catastrophes, do you really think that you're going to be able to manage that without admitting that the problems are there? Who in the world would ever think that? And so then is it not the case that you have to look at what's darkest in order to be able to contend with it? And then you might say, if that's the spirit that redeems you, in what manner is that not a sacred spirit? If it's the universal pathway to redemption in the face of suffering, which seems to be the case on psychological grounds as far as I can tell, then I don't see how you can claim that that's not real, true, foundational, all of that. I can't see a way out of that strange conundrum. So I think that partly what happens, if you do look very deeply into the suffering that characterizes your life, is that one of the things that will happen is that you will start to understand the role you play in that suffering.
Yeah.
Right? And like life seems to have an arbitrary element, and there's plenty of sick children who don't seem to deserve it morally, let's say. But when you look very hard at your own suffering and you contemplate it, the probability that you're going to see some causal role that you've played is pretty high. And then you have the option then of not doing that anymore. And that's something like confession and redemption. And that's something like also following this divine pattern, right? Is to stop doing those things that are dooming you to unnecessary suffering. And one of the things I've wondered about for a long time is that if you stop doing everything that you could that was off target, even by your own criteria, if you stop doing all of that, how much suffering would be alleviated? Not only for you, right, but for the people around you. And
most
the answer to that, well, that's
not all of it.
But
most of it.
Well, yeah, and an indefinite amount of it, right? Because it also seems like that's a sort of struggle without end, is that you can get better and better at it. And you can get more productive, and you can get more generous, and you can get better at staving off suffering, and you can get more helpful to other people and to yourself. And we don't know what the upper end of that is. Let's say we all have to deal with the catastrophe of life, with the pain and limitation of life. And so then you might say, well, how do you do that? How is it even possible to do that? And one answer might be, hide from it, bury your head in the sand. And I'm not being smart about this. It's like, the less you think about your mortal vulnerability, the better off you'll be. It's an insoluble problem. Your best bet is to run away from that realization, to keep yourself blind, and maybe to busy yourself with as much hedonic pleasure as you can possibly manage.
Drown your sorrows.
Well, and that's understandable, right? You could say, okay, well, a case can be made for that. But it's not a very psychologically astute case, because one of the things that psychologists have figured out in the last 100 years is that if you want to stabilize people psychologically, and if you want to imbue them with courage, then what you do is you help them expose themselves voluntarily to the things they're afraid of that they're avoiding. It's a very powerful technique. That's exposure therapy. And what exposure therapy seems to do is to make people braver. And I'll tell you how exposure therapy works, because it's no joke. So I had a client who was afraid that he would cut himself. And he was afraid that if he was on the top of a building, that he would jump off to his death. And one of the exercises we worked out was that he would sit at the top of his building near the edge with a knife. Yeah. Right? And that's a very frightening thing to do as a therapist, because he's saying, look, I have this impulse to slash my throat and to jump off a building. And I thought, well, why don't you confront both of those things at the same time? Now, we worked up to that, but I'm just using that as an example to show you how intense that exposure therapy can be. It's like we need to identify what, okay. So then you might think, well, what are people most fundamentally afraid of? And I would say, well, it's something like pain and death. And then even more particularly, it's unjust pain and death. And that's really at the core of the crucifixion image and story, because it's unjust suffering and death. And so the psychological, what would you say? Why have people been compelled to gaze upon this image of unjust suffering? And the answer is something like, the best way to adapt to life is to gaze on the image of unjust suffering, to do that fully. And I think that's true. There's this strange idea too, and this is a very strange idea, that the spirit that guides the Israelites out of the desert, say in the Exodus story, so the spirit that stands against tyranny and that stands against slavery, is the same spirit that confronts tragic mortality voluntarily, right? There's an equation. That's the equation of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And I also think that's likely true, that the pattern that calls to us from within to object to tyranny and slavery is the same pattern that enables us to have the courage to look upon our own mortality, like forthrightly. And I would say that has to be that way to some degree, because imagine you want to stand up to a tyrant. Well, you could put your life at risk to do that, right? I mean, if you're going to speak truth to power, to use that terrible cliche, you're going to have to face the fact that you might be hurt and even killed in doing so. And so how can it be different to face the inevitability of your own mortality for a moral cause and stand up to a tyrant? Those have to be the same thing. And so I would say it's time for all of us to learn that these axiomatic presuppositions, like the idea that part of what gives us intrinsic value is the fact that we're reflections of the Word made flesh, that actually turns out to be true.